when I reference or talk about an idea that we've kind of discussed and defined in class, for example, the idea of when you develop your identity, you're also adding the other within that identity. How in depth do I need to explain that? Or can I just assume that you know what I'm talking about and kind of move on? Like, how far should I go into defining my terms or explaining the concepts that we talk about in class? Versus like adding new ideas or analyzing whatever.
Well, good question. I mean, with respect to that specific issue, of course, I don't expect a re-articulation of Hegelian dialectic, that the model that we used in terms of identity. But if there's a value in articulating what you think happened in class, because sometimes that really doesn't match to what actually happened in class. So that gives me multiple indications how much you thought about it, how much you problematized that, because part of learning, as you hear certain propositions from me, is to question them and articulate it in your own words and see whether it works or doesn't work in certain circumstances. So that critical approach is necessary. I guess my issue is you need to write a good paper, not a good paper for me.
Yeah.
So just in general, like, I don't want to hear simply what I said in class, which doesn't happen anyway, but still, but you need to assess that. Obviously my initial response is the deeper you get into it, the better. So that's my go-to answer, but that's a tough one. I mean, because that's potentially a limitless activity too. So you can say, by concept, I mean this, by identity, you can explain every single word and every single idea, but to make something coherent. So it really needs to be determined on each case separately. So you need to decide and you need to take a risk. And I guess I understand the desire in papers to say something that is not wrong. I think you are utterly and completely concerned about that. I see that in your papers. And it turns into something defensive. Like, I'm saying something, if it is closer to what you said in class, then you are more likely to accept it and I'm not going to make a mistake. But I'm much more interested in your ability to think about the text and ask questions, problematize some of the claims, not to reject it necessarily, but question it in a deeper way so that you can accept it even better. So that's a tough one. That's like beauty of difficulty of writing, like how much you should. So, but if you are in doubt, go for it. But you can also ask about substance of the arguments and the claims and what we are doing in class. Are you clear what we are doing? How is that shaping up in relation to your other classes? If connected at all, is it certain aspects that are not fitting with your conception of politics and philosophy, etc.? So that would be also a free for all. Like, just feel free. Whatever you felt that it was stuck inside of you, get it out. Yes.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, I was rereading part of Mitchell where he talks about Arabic versus European languages, and the way in which European languages like fit into the more conceptualized, like separation of meaning and their things for meaning. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Trying to use that paper, but
I think you understand it pretty well. I think that's precisely the structure of the argument.
But like a direct example of how like I remember when we were talking about pronouns, for example, with Turkish and English. Like, is that? I just am struggling to come up with like to understand exactly how that.
Okay, well, I can speak about that particular example that I gave, but I'm not really sure how much that will be helpful to you. But in terms of his argument, Mitchell's argument, the lack of vowels in written vowels, really emphasizing the importance of the context. Now, in a culture like something like Twitter, in which you express an idea and people can discuss ad nauseum and argue and yell at each other, scream at each other about an idea expressed, really suggests that we assume that it's understood in the same way, articulated in the same way, it has a sort of uniform communication. So you can say the same sentence, exact same sentence, depending on the context, depending on the relation, interaction, that might mean something different. And we tend to formalize those sentences, like you cannot say this. You cannot say a word, you cannot say a sentence, you cannot say, I don't know, like certain. It not only depends who says it in what context, but its truth is really articulated, not truth in the sense that whether it corresponds to some ideal reality, but it's truth in terms of how much communication it allows among human beings, really depends, in this case, in Arabic, to the person who is articulating it, therefore the teacher, the significance, etc. So sometimes I think like, if I were to say these things that I say to you in the context of a class in which we have a history, in which we more or less start to understand each other, you know where I'm coming from. When I make a statements like, I said like, all Turks are lazy. Like if you take that out of the context and say, Ferit said all Turks are lazy. That's propositional content, it's pretty much the same, right? So therefore, it doesn't take these specificities into consideration. Arabic sort of forced, I don't think that actually that happens in Arabic either. I mean, it's written, it is published, it is articulated. So I don't think that Arabic has this essence of escaping this problem. But in the context of colonialism, that was one of the requirements that were forced upon them. Now, I can't really talk about that in terms of Turkish and lack of pronoun, in terms of colonialism, but of course, I find myself in a context which I never really paid attention. I mean, I don't mean like substantially, but linguistically paid attention. So all of a sudden, I am situated in a cultural context in which I need to be sensitive to the pronouns. Now, of course, I should be, because I live in this culture, so I'm not saying like I'm going to do whatever I want, but the issue is that that's not my interaction with people. That has never been my interaction with people, linguistically. So then I feel like, oh, I only know one pronoun, so in each case that I use a pronoun that I never really thought of, and it's not just me, but Turkish speakers, now you are sort of formalized your relationship. Like my relationship to you is different than that, because I need to use it. If I make certain kinds of mistakes that are probably more acceptable than other types of mistakes, and depending on the context, depending who I'm talking about, etc. So that gives this idea that there can be a general formalizable truth about how to speak. And that's my issue about the sort of formalization of language going along with the colonial project of making the world uniform. And I think that's one of the concerns about colonization, to kind of deploying difference in a certain way in order to eradicate it. That's what we do very well in certain contexts. Like we want difference, but we need to deploy that difference in such a way that we create uniformity. For example, Erlo. I love to give that example. I couldn't give it at the faculty meeting that ended like 45 minutes ago, but we want to bring people here who are different, supposedly, allegedly, because we are sort of looking at each other and seeing like we are very uniform. We need a little bit of diversity, especially among the faculty. But then we want them act in a certain way, early way. Or even to the extent that we want them to have knowledge about diversity. Like, be sensitive to diversity. What are your questions of diversity? It's like, I'm not coming from your context. I don't have the same kind of American liberal academic obsession with diversity in the same way that you do. I don't organize my relationship to people in the same performative, which I call a little bit fake kind of politeness. So if we are really accepting a kind of diversity that is genuine, then it needs to stay as diverse, as different, as contradictory. And can we really accommodate or somehow respond to that without reducing it to the same? And I think that's really the question in terms of colonial economy too. And of course, like in terms of talking academic, these might be considered different sort of concerns. But if you need to be a country who hopes to survive, you have to behave in a certain way. And if you're not, you are going to be really punished in ways that is very straightforward. So, my controversial example in this is, okay, anyway, there are some countries you can think about.
I have a question.
Sure.
So in terms of like Mitchell's argument of like dichotomy between the conceptual and material world, like realm, and like the mind and the body, and that kind of diversion of like true world. Is it like the premise of the disciplinary power or the effect of discipline?
That's a good question. I don't think it's the premise of disciplinary power, because disciplinary power's premise is really to create an individual. I think, like if we take Foucault's argument, he's saying disciplinary power emerges not because people intentionally and willfully try to create a disciplinary structure. Now, for example, our government today, not 6 months ago, but our government today is actually trying to protect us from dying. And you might somehow say like, well, they don't really aim to create certain structures of surveillance, etc. But in order to achieve a certain end, they need to deploy certain mechanisms, and they lead to disciplinary structures. So if you look at it at the intention of the power, the person who is deploying it, I don't think that anybody today would deploy power in the name of, I want to control you and I want to exploit your resources. I mean, I don't think you can get away with that, at least discursively, at any time. But what you are saying is that I'm actually doing it for your own good. This is this sort of rhetoric. Now, disciplinary structures emerge because we want to create subjects. We want to create individual subjects who are related to each other in terms of a contract. We try to understand each other as belonging to this community or society, rather, in terms of contractual obligations. But Foucault's claim is that that would mean certain consequences. Those consequences did not happen. Most specifically, the representational relationship between crime and the punishment. What happened is a deployment of certain modulation of time in terms of your behavior. Now, this might be prison, but you don't think prison in the same way, and you shouldn't because we are not in prison, not in terms of living your life according to a schedule. But prison is where the idea of modulating your time and living in a certain way emerges. Now, what is my aim in prison? To keep you there, to not hurt other people, to possibly, if at all, if you are sort of delusionally Quaker, to rehabilitate you or something like that. But in society, we have the same kind of concerns, namely to keep you in check, not to hurt other people, not to be unruly, not to be hurtful to the other members of the society. And that's what I do by modulating your time. Now, then you say, oh, wow, Ferit, that's just such outrageous comparison between prison and the sort of modulation of our time, except when you read the prison industrial complex making the next move, now they've decided more and more, oh, prisons are too expensive and too sort of politically problematic. We are going to imprison people, quote unquote, within their communities through surveillance, through tracking devices, etc. So we are actually going to integrate them into the community with respect to certain technological mechanisms. And people who invest in the prison industrial complex are already investing in these electronic technological devices. Now you see a pattern emerging in terms of regulation of a society that, while it is not a physical prison, takes its premises from the physical prison. So therefore, I would say the kind of colonization in terms of disciplinary power and the relationship between these, I don't even know, like, I expect you to come up with a philosophically tight and sound argument about how this works even for Mitchell. I don't even think that Mitchell knows that. But all I want you to do is to be able to think certain philosophical presuppositions in relation to something that we consider to be very concrete and specific and up to your flesh. That's my interest. So what does some philosophical idea have anything to do with the prison? It's like, well, it kind of does. And if you see that, then you sort of like, oh, isn't it wonderful? We are now disinvesting from prisons. People are going to get out. That's what I wanted. I'm an evolutionist. Sure, great. Yet, what is coming next? And that's how colonialism always works. They're like, oh, isn't it great that we are going to get rid of this French government? Well, they already deployed the people with the briefcases to do what they continue to do in terms of performing certain functions. So you always need to be vigilant in trying to emancipate yourself, what kind of power structures you are subjecting yourself. So, and that's a philosophical question to me, conceptual question, which allows you to see certain things. You don't, I mean, I don't really need 10 years from empirical research in which they are going to prove actually now prison industrial complex is investing in tracking devices, and now, I mean, they're already doing this. You can see this. So we are always like with scientifically sort of behind the curve in terms of, oh, I need an empirical evidence for that. No, just wait. It'll be too late by then. So therefore, when Derrida says decolonization is interminable, I don't take him to mean like, oh, you keep doing it for the rest of your life. But it's like, how does it transform into the other reconfiguration? Yes, Claudia, I saw you. They all saw you too. They get nervous when they see that hand. They're like, somebody wants to talk and I'm not letting. Yeah, go ahead.
No, like my question is kind of related to that because I was thinking of it in the sense of like how even these colonial structures and like like have worked in a way of like even making society police each other, and like in the sense of like there was a, I think I didn't write it down, but there was like a part of the reading that like talked about how like it was like it was the model of school was a model of like perfect society, and like how you were taught to act, and then like if even like if you saw someone else from your own society like act differently, like in a some like, do you think like judgment could work in a way of policing and like perpetuating those like colonial structures that work as discipline, as like judgment from each other?
Sure. Of course, I would say that I would be careful about that because uh, the judgment plays two different roles here. Um, as like you allow certain things to happen in the midst of a community if you are convinced that they are harmless.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, so if I say it's colonial, then that would be problematic because I guess even before coming to class, you had some kind of allergy towards the term colonization, and you always thought it was something negative, terrible, oppressive, etc. Which, sure, but unfortunately, it's not that simple. It also operates in different registers. So we do that to each other in the name of, like, in the name of positive judgment. Like whenever you say, oh, you are so successful in this, that's so wonderful. You don't really think that you are doing anything restricting, shaping to that person because you are making that person perform. Now, when you say judgmental, I assume that you are referring to the negative judgments of policing. And we are always thinking about the role of the police in this negative way, which it is, of course, but there is a more insidious aspect of the police in the sense that in order to avoid that negative, we act in ways that we already restrict ourselves. So whenever I say to you, Claudia, you are such a law-abiding citizen, that's wonderful. I am really seeing the potential of your existence within the boundaries of the law that exists today. Then by praising you, I'm actually pushing you into that kind of model. So for example, like you say, well, there are certain people who might come outside of Earlham, but they fit really well. We say that as a sort of positive, they will fit really well. And we assume that that's good, etc. But that in itself is also not unproblematic. Now, of course, these are all matter of degrees. I don't expect you to become paranoid about everything you say and think, whether it's colonial, etc. But they become issues and it becomes difficult to articulate that. So yes, I can say communities always police themselves. And we think that's going to be great, like, because people today say like community policing. It's like, really? Do you want community policing? Do you want like police just like right up your face, or not even like present, but we are going to police each other, like snitching on each other, etc. So that's a real concern. And but when we have these catch-all solutions like community policing, we believe that, oh, that's going to solve all of our problems. Yeah, well, maybe relatively speaking, it's going to be good for some people, but I'm not sure in the long run it's going to make the society more emancipated. So that's a concern. Yeah, so I'm not sure that answers your question, but I would say yes, definitely.
No, yeah, it goes like, so in other words, like the same structure of like trying to bind and trying to be a good citizen so you're not judged is also part of like
Yes.
it's part of that same structure that is like that we don't even understand, or like we don't see as much as like the negative in this case, like even going with the same laws or everything, like we are still going in that same like method of organization that like Timothy Mitchell is kind of like alluding to, as like in the sense of like how like the disciplinary structures are working towards like the colonial, and even like judging because you break out of those structures is colonial, but also like if you bind and like go with those structures, you're also part of the colonial. So it's kind of like non-escapable in a kind of way.
Well, again, I don't want to say categorically non-escapable, but always to escape from something always exposes you to be the possibility of being caught up in something else. So I don't want you, I mean, you shouldn't think about like, oh, this is like, whatever I do is going to be colonial, therefore I can do whatever. There are always relative values. Yes, I think the prison industrial should add, we should take people out of prison. That's a relatively emancipatory step, but without thinking necessarily like this solves the problem, that we can go home. And that's really the kind of global solutions that we seek, and our failure to find global solutions lead us not to seek for any solutions or delude ourselves that our local solutions is global. So I think that I'm trying to sort of negotiate that difficult task rather than saying like, I'm sure at the end of the class, you'll be like, oh, Faith, whatever we do, we are going to be colonial or something. I mean, not in the same way. And not all colonialisms are created equal. Maybe yes, maybe we need to choose between different forms of colonialism, but that's still something and makes a whole lot of a difference for a lot of people. So it's not categorical in the sense that you are always going to be pure, uncontaminated by colonial tendencies. And that's the domain of the political. You need to negotiate that. Yes.
So in my essay, I kind of talk about the trap of colonialism in terms of creating an identity. Because when you have an identity, it will always be in reference to the other. It means you just affirm the colonizing power when you're like, oh, I'm gonna go back to my traditional past or whatever. You're still like using the language of colonialism. But Mitchell has a specific phrase that I was really intrigued by, talking about a different definition of difference that doesn't deal in structure and order and like identifying this is not that, but instead it's more fluid, I guess. It's kind of the difference between Arabic and French, how Arabic relies on the context and the words all interact with each other based on whatever else is there. It's not one word represents one ideal. And I'm trying to explore that new definition of difference as a possibility for maybe blurring the borders of colonialism. Would that be a valid? I mean, this is what my 5.5 pages are written about right now. So if you say no, then I'm kind of fucked. But is that a valid point to argue, or is it? Because I'm not trying to escape from the trap of colonialism, but maybe explore ways to kind of just fuzz it out a little.
I have to say yes,
Yes,
under
you
the
have to say
circumstances,
yes.
but I also think that, yes, it is valuable. I think one issue is just like it's conceptually problematic to assume that you are grounding your identity on your own. You really cannot adequately articulate your difference without the other. So you cannot say I'm different from the other without the sort of that background of the other. So yes, I think, I mean, of course, I want you to think about these questions conceptually and write for them conceptually, but my secret hope is that you find ways of translating these into ways of being in the world in certain context. So for me, for example, like I always operate with the assumption, like I don't even know my identity. It is not something that I don't have authority over. Like, I have no freaking clue what you are thinking, attributing, negotiating with respect to me, and I can't control that, and I shouldn't control that. So part of that, I don't even like have any authority. But also that kind of says like, why am I invested in certain belongings that are not even genuinely mine? Like, do I need to defend, I don't know, Turks? Do I need to defend man? Do I need to defend Durham faculty? Do I need to defend being an American? Do I need to defend whatever? I always find myself in these positions like, as like, who even told me this? And that kind of confident, assured relationship to the identity categories really is both harmful to the others, but also problematic for my own existence. So I don't know. I mean, I can't, this is like a, obviously it is a valuable inquiry and explanation. So I wouldn't say, no, just dismiss that, Esther. But it really depends on how you execute it and how deeply you think about it. But it's a good, yeah. I mean, it's already there, you know that. You already wrote for it, like you didn't ask me before, so it's fine. Those of you who turned on off your cameras, I assume you're not there anymore. I guess not. Too late. Anna, you are like absent now. So. Any other questions, comments? Anything like? Yes, please, Nana.
So I'm trying to think through this with the panopticon from a paper. It feels like it seems to me that in what we've been talking about, in how the panopticon is manifested materially, that it's never perfect. It's not actually like panopticon. Like with the schools in colonizing Egypt, there's the 24 hours that they get out in the town, or there's the cafes where that chaos like sort of obfuscates people from the panopticon. What power does an incomplete, imperfect panopticon have then? And does sort of is it accurate to say that when you construct a panopticon, you're also necessarily sort of delineating a space outside of the panopticon? And so like defines its own limitations, and so it's never an actual pan complete opticon.
Well, I mean, there are two uses at this in Foucault, and I think Mitchell is aware of that. There is actually that structure, the kind of architectural structure that exists. So there is an observation tower from which you look at your prison, the prisoners. Now, it's not efficient to put one guard to each prisoner, for each prisoner, right? So to control their behavior. So you find a solution of being able to control. Now, also the problem is when there is one prison, the prisoner sees the guard as well as the other way around. So when you are visible, you cannot exercise your power as effectively. So that exists. Now, of course, it's not perfect, because if it explains everything, as I keep saying, it doesn't explain anything, because it doesn't explain different forms of power. So like if power was so pervasive and so uniform, so universal, we wouldn't even be aware of it. just like there are universal things that we don't really pay attention to, like, having noses and eyes, and like not all of us, but like, that's sort of like the more applicable it is, the less meaningful it is. Like, I discovered something really amazing about human beings. They have 2 ears. And it's like, okay, what do I do with that as an explanation? But when it becomes something discriminatory, not in a negative sense, but discriminates something another, then it's interesting. So disciplinary power, that panopticon in which we should obviously think that there are people who have power, who exercise power, like in your family, because your parent usually controls the money and the room, etc. So they can exercise power over you. But there are also ways in which power is exercised by us and on us in ways that are not immediately visible. And panopticon, of course, becomes a model according to which we can understand that. Absolutely not a perfect model. And therefore, we are not constantly observed. And I think there is a certain sort of threshold. For example, if everybody is observed at all times and it in turn into a data, I don't know whether you know about algorithm and computers, etc. What will happen? If everybody is observed at all times, all the time, and they collected data, which they do, it's a completely useless data because you don't know how to negotiate that data. You can't go through it and fine. So if it becomes an all-pervasive structure, then it loses its effect and significance and importance. But if it is discriminatory enough that sees what you are doing this as opposed to that, then it is insidious and problematic. So it is, as you say, absolutely not a perfect structure. That's why it's effective.
I think more what I mean is what the sense I got was that the panopticons was like there's not constant observation, but there's always the threat of observation that you could be being watched. What I'm seeing in especially like in the cafes that Mitchell talks about, it's almost like in like the architectural panopticon, there's a closet where you're not observed and you know that you're not observed. And if there's a space, if there's that kind of imperfection, where there's a space that people can inhabit where they know they're not being observed, where they know that there's sort of a vulnerability in the panopticon, what power does the panopticon have then? Because it feels to me that like that weakness kind of undermines the entire thing.
No, I mean, that's an absolutely legitimate question. And that's, of course, it's not, if there is such a place. And we conceptualize that place as a closet, as you said, like cut off from the rest of the world. But then what disruptive effect does it even have? I mean, sure, you can have your privacy. I mean, isn't this the paradox of privacy? You can have privacy as long as I allow you to have privacy, because as long as you are private, you are not a threat to society. Just go be there. I don't care. My issue is not like, what are you going to do disruptively? That needs to be present. That needs to be visible. Otherwise, that particular privacy is not disruptive because it's private, right? So society can tolerate that. The political power can tolerate that. I mean, the power can say like, you do whatever you want in your own room. Well, except if you have a computer and telephone, then you are not really private, isolated, cut off. You can communicate with other people and do something potentially disruptive. So actually, you don't even need to protect privacy if you have it, because it's by definition doesn't. But is there such a place? Is there like a sort of disruptive specificity? And more importantly, do people even think, act disruptively if they had those spaces? That, because for the political power, for it to function effectively, people would bring something disruptive, problematic from those spaces. But just imagine, like, do we even think in the darkest, deepest of our thoughts anything disruptive as human beings? Or when I'm alone, I'm not fantasizing about killing millions of people, etc., but I'm thinking, how can I be a better individual? It's like, okay, you are cool. You have no problem for me. You are not a political threat in any way because you already are policing yourself in your deepest, most private thoughts. And we spend a lot of education to get you to that space. Not just be a good moral individual, but be a productive, responsible member of the society. You owe it to other people. You should not even think in your deepest, darkest thought. I mean, you should definitely not say it. That's communication, but you shouldn't even have it. And people say that, this is what, like, I'm not racist. I don't have any racist thoughts. I don't know. Maybe you do. Maybe when you are alone in your own room, you are thinking horrible things. I don't know. I was like, no. What? Please believe me. I'm like wonderful. Or like, I never really thought of blowing up a place. Okay, now that's picked up by an essay, and they're going to say, oh, professor argued to blow up places, etc. So I don't think that. I wouldn't do that. That's irrational. That's ridiculous. I won't do that. I would never, definitely not do that. Just for whoever is watching the YouTube. So.
I have a question. So could that go into the idea of like mental, like self-colonization and like or like colonizing thoughts of like, even though you think that you have like this privacy and far away from like being observed, but like you still observe yourself, and like, and to a certain extent, like you still like check upon yourself as like, oh, is this like correct? Or even like accepting that is incorrect, but still like knowing that is incorrect. Could that be related to like what like you were talking about?
Claudia, you know the answer to that, of course. I mean, obviously. Why are you asking me? You're absolutely right. Sure.
I just like want to make sure, because like, yes, because like it just stems from the same idea of like privacy, but still like you're like, these colonial powers are still like acting upon you.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, that's why I'm sure that you are in some sort of social media. People who write like, we need to decolonize this, that, and the other thing are the ones who are thinking in the most structural, problematic, disciplinary fashion, right? So that's the paradox, right? Like, whatever that decolonization might mean, we haven't even, I claim, understood how that even functions, how that sort of penetrates our thoughts. We are just sort of like, it's cool, let's just decolonize. It sounds good. It's like, but you're absolutely right. Then, you know, what you are proposing, what you are trying to do is precisely deploying further mechanisms and rules and regulations. And there's a really interesting psychoanalyst, social theorist, Alenka Zupancic. She writes on like social theory and psychoanalysis. She makes that point with respect to left and right in a sort of particularly bizarre way, especially in the United States. All of a sudden, the right wings are sort of like emancipatory. I can say whatever I want. I'm free, blah, blah. And the left is like the opposite, like we need to have more rules to regulate our behavior and control our basic instinct. It's like the bizarre kind of interplay. That's precisely the issue. Like decolonization suggests a kind of emancipation and a kind of freedom, blah, blah, but it actually suggests much more intrinsic, intricate disciplining. And yes, that is the definition of self-colonization. And I would argue that we haven't even started to understand multiple ways in which we colonize very consciously our own process of thinking. That's really sort of paradox of life, paradox of living. So, especially in a modern society in the 21st century in the West. But that's a good question. Yes, self-colonization. I think that's worth pursuing. You look tired today. Why is that? Working on the paper until late hours of the evening? Yeah, let's take a break until like 2:05 or so, like 12, 13 minutes, and then come back, wake up, and
Like, said that it's like installing the idea of like imaginary like structure through like education and like other military excluding city planning stuff and install the representation of Egypt from European perspective to these people, enable them to create the conceptual realm of ideal society. And that is it true that that led to the division of the conceptual world and material?
well, sure, yes, I think that sounds right.
I'm not really sure how, also at the same time, like how like writings and like changes in like language, like the mystification of authority, like also quite coincided with that, right?
Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, so like, what do you mean by like through? Yeah, like through that. You mean like cause in terms of
Causes,
Can you hear them?
like split the conception?
yeah,
Yeah,
Did you say cause?
yeah, like is it like in terms of cause, like this like ordering of the space causes this.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's how I kind of formulated. Like the ordering of the spaces and disciplining led to the split of the concept and material.
Like, I also think like I was trying to write this last night. So like causality is such a weird thing.
Yeah.
It's like, because your first question also about preference, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, cause I'm not, it's never really clear as to what is like leading to what. But then on the other hand, I'm not even sure if he's really articulating things in terms of like this leads to this.
Right.
And I don't know what the
Yeah.
modes of articulation is. And there's like one particular facet where he talks about like
Why don't we go to those places if
Yeah.
that will clarify?
so there's this passage on page 94.
94, page 94. That's the end of chapter 3.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's like just that third from here.
Yet at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, at the same time, I tried to show this car or something. Not too difficult. the work by creating, and then so the power of like the creating spaces more than anything. Was something metaphysical. The work by creating an appearance of order, an appearance of structure as some sort of separate non-material realm. The creation of this metaphysical realm is what made the education of the individual suddenly imperative, just as the micro-physical method of work made such education possible. And that like that sentence on like the imperative of the possible, it's like it seems to suggest some kind of like causal link, almost like the metaphysical, like the conceptual materials with that metaphysical relation is sort of almost like
But I'm not really sure, like, what do you mean by causal here?
Yeah, I don't know if that's the correct terminology myself, like, but like, I'm not sure if he's establishing that or he's doing something else. Like that language of imperative and then what makes the imperative possible seems to be how, like, especially here, like the microphysical and metaphysical relationship is like in that relationship of the possible and then the imperative. But I'm not sure if that is a causal relationship.
It can only be a causal relationship. It is deployed consciously, right? So we need a sort of, we need this, and for this we need to do that. Therefore, let's do that. That would be a causal thing. So I think part of the difficulty is not like people who are in the process of deploying colonizing power are explicitly talking about concepts or ideas or causes, etc. So this is an explanatory framework in order to be able to engage with some of the actions of colonialism. You need to make certain philosophical, metaphysical presuppositions. Now, because people started to educate, formalize education, somehow think that there's a possibility and necessity for educating individuals in a uniform way. Then you need to say, they try to do this, and then they never thought, well, because metaphysically we really need to explicitly educate these people, blah, blah. They thought like, we need to create a society. Now, why do we need to create this society? Because the way in which we are doing things now is not working. So this is posed as a very pragmatic question. Like, we cannot punish people properly, we cannot communicate with each other properly, we cannot mostly carry our goods and services effortlessly throughout the world. Therefore, we need to have a transparent society, etc. And then we need to produce, and in order to be able to produce, we need to do that, etc. So all these so-called practical, pragmatic concerns bring a metaphysical presupposition with it. Namely, a society should be a well-functioning artificial machine. It might be so obvious for us today to say, like, of course, I want to work in a well-functioning society as opposed to non-well-functioning society. Or you might say, well, I don't care. I'm cool. I'm sort of, but then you go to a place like foreign study, study abroad, you operate within a society which is recalcitrant for you. It's not functioning very well. It's like, I can't even go to the bank. I can't get my identity card. What the hell is happening in the society? This is problematic. It is like opaque, and it is not easily navigatable. So I am making the metaphysical assumption that the world should be a place in which I should be able to navigate. Like, how did you make that assumption? Because you take it for granted. And you say, Faith, are you crazy? Of course I want to get my identity card. It's like, sure, but this is not because you are naturally a human being who longs for identity cards. This is the result of a certain way of living in society for centuries. Now, does that cause society to be in a certain way? Well, that's not really his mode of explanation in terms of X caused Y and Y caused Z, etc. But certain things happen. What are the presuppositions of this? What led to this? What is necessary, as you said, if not sufficient condition of this? One condition is that I want to live in a transparent society. I want to live in a society which is well regulated. And I don't even think that explicitly ever, unless I'm confronted with a society or even architecture, even like just like how you feel in a building that is not logically properly organized. Like even this building, I mean, there is really no like physical going down in the middle of the building, right? You need to use the elevator if you are in the middle of the building in LBC, or you have to walk to one side or the other side. It's like, that's not rational, that's crazy. Like, you know, who did this? So even that bothers you in terms of how you move in space. But it's not just how you move in physical space, but in assumptions, like certain human beings speak a certain way, therefore they are accessible to me. And imagine like how disorienting it is to be with someone who doesn't speak your language. Then like, if you are in a space, then you either have to learn language or it's easier to make them learn your language. So these are all presuppositions about the being of human being, where and how human beings should exist. And it appears to be pretty straightforward and obvious. And that's really where the metaphysical assumptions come in. So the ideal, and I also argue that you make an assumption about what it means for you to be an ideal of yourself. Like we always operate with this assumption, like, you know, I'm always striving to be better. It's like, why? Like, why? You just live, eat, and die. That's life. Like, why is it that I need to be the best of myself? Just chill. Like, why? But there is the kind of expectation that we have in terms of what it means to be. As an individual, I need to achieve, I need to prove myself, I need to demonstrate myself, and all. As a society, we need to like move forward, be more advanced, more, etc. And that we consider to be good and better living. And colonialism has that assumption in terms of confronting a society which doesn't have order. Then you'll say, order according to what? Do you have that order? Well, you don't in France and England, etc. But you have a projection of an order, and you deploy mechanisms that can create that order, and you can bring those mechanisms back. So it's almost like the colonies are these historical, you know, sort of laboratories in which you try these micro physical methods and then bring them back to that. Now, maybe they do not explicitly have this metaphysical idea as a cause in their minds, but the Mitchell's intervention is that there is a philosophical, conceptual framework underlying the actions of colonial powers. So don't like necessarily think of a positivist social scientist in terms of causes and effects, but how you are trying to explain a process.
I guess, yeah, I have a sort of follow-up, just like maybe I'm not because like yeah, so it's like causality sort of implies sort of conscious like deliberation, but then like assumptions and like presuppositions are they like they're sort of held, right? Like somebody holds this presupposition and then
Not explicitly, yes.
not explicitly they. So it's like if the person sort of articulating the order and whatnot holds a presupposition, but obviously because it's a presupposition, they don't know they hold it, but then like someone else can like see they hold that presupposition and and then sort of trace how it influences what they do. But that's not exactly like
Sure.
that process.
Well, I mean, you can call it causality, but not in the same way that we understand causality. But also to explain what may or may not be motivating colonial powers is not to explain a conscious subject doing certain things, because colonialism is a process in which many different actors played many different roles. So if you are clergy, you might actually be kind of this helping the natives to become more religiously, liberated, but also you might contradict to other aspect of colonialization, which is there for material purposes. So they might share the same metaphysical presuppositions about what it means to live better, but their aims might contradict each other. So therefore, I don't want to totalize colonization as a kind of unitary, transparent process. There are multiple actors with different, like you saw in Avatar, like the Sigourney Weaver is, wow, she's like there for knowledge, as opposed to this greedy guy who just wants profit, and the military guy who just wants to blow up people and kill, not people. So, and you see that they are in conflict with each other. And then this guy who actually joins them because he's the ultimate colonizer, because that's the best way of colonizing. Now, you can say, well, then it, like colonization, well, if it is good, it cannot be colonization. It's like, well, not really. Because certain people will benefit, and people do benefit from colonization, especially those who participate in those power structures. So yeah, it's complicated. So I don't want to sort of attribute like this is an analysis of a heterogeneous power that sometimes contradicts itself. Therefore, Mehmet Ali was asking that question in terms of, panopticon is not really panopticon, pan meaning everything, like, what's that box? Pandora's box, yeah. All gifts box, that pan is like all, everything, and Dora is Dora is gift, right? Theodore is gift of God. Dora should be like some Greek word, Dora or whatever. Yeah, so Pandora is like gift of everything. So it is contradicting with each other, different aspects. So that doesn't really work with causality, because causal is like, if X happens, Y is going to happen. Like, no, X happens, sometimes Y happens, sometimes doesn't. And that is not a sort of weak explanation, or you try to come up with a contradictionless explanation. That's why I stay away from cause. And today they said, what did they say? I was listening to NPR. The scientists have not established any causal link between vaccines and something. As if like scientists ever established causal links that they might say it's caused. They would say, well, even when you say something causes something, that is not a conceptual cause that we think of like X causes Y, because you sometimes take the vaccine, sometimes die, sometimes don't. So it's predominantly, there's a very causal-like relationship between getting the vaccine and not dying, but it might not happen. But 95%, so that's good enough for you, just go ahead. That's pretty good. It's almost like gambling all the time, with really good odds. So.
Wait, so like not causality, it's like colonizers did not necessarily have the intention to create a disciplinary like state, but like they're simple notion of like ordering the state.
Yes, and that's absolutely right. Yes, they did not. And in fact, that's not even how humans usually operate. Like nobody says, let me deploy a disciplinary power here. You say like, I want to improve education. I want to improve the health of society.
Right.
I want to be useful to people. I want to uphold my society and community and improve it. So you don't really have those, even to yourself, the kind of conceptual aims like, let me deploy some colonizing power here or something. But that's also like how this is also a model in which we can, not just in this class, not in terms of colonization, but in terms of history, in terms of politics, in terms of anthropology, in terms of sociology, we can understand human behavior is almost always contradictory. As we try to attribute some kind of transparent aims, intentions to actors, we are trying to make sense of something that is otherwise difficult to make sense of. And we reduce it to human action, which works both in terms of scientific explanation better, but also morally. Like when you say colonizers, like as if that is a monolithic group of people who have similar aims. No, well, there are different contradictory ways of being a colonizer. Now you can say, wow, that colonizer doesn't mean anything for me. Sure, throw it away. I don't care, as long as we understand what people are doing and what kind of impacts it's having. So you are sort of using that term, like not you, but like in general, like, oh, it's a colonizer, it's bad. Like, I don't want to go there. Like, how not to be a colonizer? Like, I don't like that. That's almost like a both theoretical and intellectual sort of problem for not understanding what is happening properly. So for me, it's more important to understand like how you observe some of the structures of disciplinary power, like school, because it didn't exist. It didn't have any formal education. We didn't have a standing army, not we, they didn't have a standing army. So it's historically important that there is a standing army emerging. Now, did they say, let's get some disciplinary power here, or we need an army that functions efficiently? They are experts so that they can kill better, so that we don't lose the wars. So they don't think like, let's create. But what they do is to create a well-regulated army, standing army. And then they say like, you know, we want to be able to sell our products, for example, everywhere in the United States. Well, some parts don't understand how it works. Some parts cannot speak English. Some parts don't use the same, let's have an education. Let's have imagine a country like the United States, you can have a national educational strategy. That's pretty remarkable. So like you have to take your hat off to disciplinary power. It works pretty well.
So it's like that process of like making society like well regulated.
Sure.
Society ultimately like install discipline power, even though like they didn't really.
Yeah.
And like I have another question.
Uh-huh.
So like their desire to make, I mean, the Egyptian society like a better place, like arise from like sides like Orientalism, this idea of like Orient opposed to the Europe, and ultimately like Orient is like a negation of the Europe. And
well, that's complicated because that is Said mostly read as a kind of continuous and uniform representation of the Orient. And of course, Said has a point there, but maybe things are much more complicated than he even imagines in terms of, as you read in this book too, when you represent Egyptians, you are also representing the previous greatness of Egyptians. So you are an amazing civilization. you lost that because now we are more powerful. You are now a corrupt and sort of not so great civilization. So representation is both, yes, compared to us politicians, straightforward, sort of simplistic, like Cromer, I think that he talks about at the beginning of second chapter of Orientalism, and he says like Egyptians cannot represent themselves, we can rule them better than they can rule themselves, etc. All that kind of talk gives you one aspect of colonialism, which is true. But also like this kind of fascination with the incredible greatness, lost greatness of Egyptians that we are trying to recreate through colonial intervention. It's like humankind has never been great. Egyptian, American, Chinese, whatever, like that's just a myth. Like, but by just creating like, and then we all in the West is like, yeah, Egyptians were so wonderful. We are horrible, but Egyptians were great. It's like that's the same kind of postulation of a lost origin, which is the origin of humankind. And you know, if you look at like colonial representation, there is always that search for the origin of humanity. Almost before the fall, almost before being kind of corrupted by the modernity and the capitalism and all that jazz, we were like wonderful, living with each other in a harmonious way, etc. That is also a colonial project. Like, and then that is actually a much easier to sell to Egyptians than how terrible they are. It's like, oh, we were great. Like in the past, we were wonderful. Let's get there. And that again goes back to that origin of identity. Like somehow you are going to recuperate a sort of origin in terms of which you are going to articulate your purity, or at least a pure knowledge. And I read the same way the sort of preoccupation with your DNA as the same, like, oh, I know exactly what I am now. I mean, percentage-wise, sure, but not just pure something, but at least I know exactly what I am, because that's what I belong to. That's what I discover who I really am. So actually I should be wearing like kilt and dance because I'm 20% Scottish and I didn't know. Now I know who I really am. Whatever. I mean, by whatever I mean stupid. Yes, Masha.
You know, I was just thinking about how when you get the DNA test, and I mean, obviously the borders, they change all the time, right? So what does it say then? Like, does it tell us according to like the contemporary borders? Or do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Especially if you are anywhere from Europe, like you can't really tell, because when I was growing up, there were like maybe half as many countries in Europe as there are now. So like I'm from that region. It's like Soviet Union, for example, like now it's like so many different, yeah, that's a good question. But I mean, that desire, like, I mean, it sounds more sort of fractured, obviously, in terms of its percentages and the way in which DNA works. But the desire is the same, to discover that original constitution, my original constitution, and that's going to have some kind of existential impact on my life. Maybe I'll do it anyway. So. After yelling and screaming for years, that's performative contradiction. I was like, oh, I'm like 100% Turkish, yeah. So Caitlin, how is your paper going?
It's good.
I'm glad you know how to unmute yourself. That's good. Anna, don't laugh. What's going on with you?
I'm just a laughy person.
How is your paper going?
It's going well. In one of our first class discussions about the book, Mitchell's book, we were talking about like how to think philosophically, and it's not so much like how should we think philosophically, it's what kind of questions we should ask, like how should we live? And I'm trying to figure out how to, I guess, place the division of body and mind in conversation with that question. Like, do colonized subjects get to ask that question or not? Do they get to ask that question? But like, is it even possible that they know to ask themselves that question? And so I'm kind of playing around with that, like the depletion of subjectivity, sort of. Yeah.
That's a really good question. You should take modern philosophy. This kind of traditional mind-body division distinction starting with Descartes, that allegedly in the 16th, 17th century, really 17th century actually. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know whether you explicitly think about that, how you experience even yourself in terms of a conceptual distinction, like when did human beings started to make that distinction, like I have a body and then I have a mind and my mind is different and then my soul is immortal, etc. So,
well,
sorry.
No,
Go ahead.
I'm kind of struggling. I don't want to take too much class time, obviously, but I'm kind of struggling with how to like approach this idea that I just don't know if it's correct to say like the colonized subject is essentially like diminished into like a vessel, like the physicalities are there, like the organs and the skin, and but is it really just a vessel? Is it as simple as that? Like they house like the colonial agenda in their bodies and minds, and then it's just like I don't know. I've realized like halfway through this paper, I've confused myself a little bit. I don't know if I'm wording things the right way, but I don't know.
No, that's really actually an interesting question, because part of what is different in part of the difficulty of thinking disciplinary power is really this problem and the questionable but interesting Foucauldian idea that the resistance to power is already inscribed into the functioning of the power. So not only it gives you the tools and the spaces from which that you can resist, but it actually thrives on that resistance. And that makes our sort of job or thinking all the more complicated, because I'm thinking like, if I resist power, then I resist power, then it goes away. That's what resistance means. Why should I be contributing to the functioning of the power by resisting it? There's a simple opposition here. I'm resisting it. So otherwise, I'm just a pure vessel, right? So it just sort of goes through me. But the point is, this is the insidiousness of power, disciplinary power in general, but colonial power in particular, by that resistance. Yes, you are resisting to a certain phase and manifestation of that power, but you are actually contributing to the transformation and change of that power. Then you will say, oh, wow, yeah, well, if it is a different kind of power, why do you even call it with the same name? But that's the concept. That's what we learn from Hegel. Identity is always a function of difference. I can say, well, you are not the same Daniel that you were 5 years ago. Why am I calling you Daniel? everything in your body, in your mind has changed. Like, on what basis am I calling you that? Well, there is a certain contradiction. There's a certain opposition that is built into what we consider to be identity. Okay, don't call it a disciplinary power, as long as you see the identity of the relations that are within that movement, right? So then I would say it's not just a vessel, because that's not just being colonized, is like passive. You are actually actively participating in your own colonization.
Yeah, I think the conclusion that I'm working towards is they don't know to resist, or I guess like it's more like they're existing within this facade of subjectivity because they're given tools and means that would seem like they have access to, you know, subjecthood. You know, education. They're given their little section in the city that the colonizers call like the Oriental, even though, like, I mean, that whole chapter on like the structure of the city, it's kind of tucked away in a corner to authenticate like this world exhibition sort of. And I think like, yeah, that's what I'm working towards. It's like, that's the danger of colonization, is that the colonized subjects believe that they are authentic selves when they're like existing in this facade.
Exactly. In fact, to be an authentic self is kind of perform yourself in a certain way. Yeah, no, that's a very interesting. Yeah, good. Take up more time. It's okay. I think this really comes through very well in the case of Turkey. I don't know whether you know it, but in Turkish history, there is this crucial moment from the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic. Is like there is this rhetoric of resisting the imperial powers, like fighting against them, kicking them out of because you are occupied. There is that kind of independence war. I mean, I'm sure every nation has a form of independence war, but in the case of Turkey, that's very interesting because you are getting rid of these foreign powers. There is that idea of like kicking them out. Yet, that is framed in a discussion of modernization. And modernization is virtually equal to westernization. So this performance of a paradox of I am finding my authentic self by fighting and kicking out precisely that identity which I'm trying to become. And then once Turkey allegedly kind of kicks out all these powers, then our civil laws come from Switzerland, our law comes from France, our education comes from England. So you sort of become what you are ostensibly fighting against. And I think that's a very good example, and I don't think it's unique, but it's a very glaring example of the contradiction that is associated with the process of decolonization or independence or because being independent is already being in a peculiar relationship, not being in a non-relationship. So all the countries, especially those who have the misfortune of having oil, for example, know what it means to be independent. Like you need to execute that in a certain way of relationship with the others. So yeah, that's a interesting conceptual problem. Obviously, you are all aware of that.
I have a question. Like, it's more about logistics about the paper. As like we see so many like disciplinary structures through the reading, should we maybe like choose one and focus on one, or should like we try to explore more, or just as to our discretion?
It really depends on what you are trying to do. Like if you just want to give an example of how disciplinary power functions, I think army, school, whatever is fine. I don't expect you to explain each one of them. If you explain the logic of it, that's perfectly fine. So, but it's really up to you. I mean, obviously everything is up to you, but don't, yeah, I mean, you can explain with one. Roy, how is your paper going?
Pretty good, speaking, but I've also been thinking about something else. I'm also taking an art history class, and recently we've been talking about like the concept of like memorials and monuments in like relation to like if how they're being used for profit, how they're being taken like cultural wise. Basically, I've been thinking about for my paper, how can I combine the concept of combine that concept with the idea of colonialism and disciplinary structures.
Say that part about culture again, like how that manifests itself in the culture.
Plus,
Did you say yes?
yeah.
Well, I mean, even the concept of culture, like the fact that you need to understand certain human organization or human togetherness in terms of what a pretty Western conception of culture, which expresses in terms of art, among other things, is really a kind of, I mean, I don't want to say colonial, but it's a sort of desire to know, desire to be able to have access and information about the society. I think the point of this that you need to be very explicit about is like, in order to produce knowledge about any object, including natural, but also cultural or human or social object, you need to somehow produce that object through power and make it emerge as an object, make it knowable. Now, that doesn't mean that your knowledge is invalid or it needs to be dismissed, etc. But there is an epistemological disciplinary power that is at work that we need to be aware of. Now, you cannot know Egyptian culture, whatever that means, unless you make that which you are supposed to know knowable. How do you make knowable? In order to be able to extract certain information, you need to make it accessible. Accessible, I gave this example about the schools, for example, but also what are your aspirations and desires and what is your character? Now, how can you tell the character of a culture? How would you learn the character of American culture if you are an anthropologist from a different society interested in it? What do you think? Like, first of all, you'll question, like, is there an American culture, an American character? What the hell are you talking about? But well, I say, no, this is an assignment. You have to do it. Just go. Where would you go?
Yeah, because that's in line because we recently talked about authenticity, which might be able to like bring into this as well.
Yeah, so exactly. And where do you express that? You should know that because you are a senior art major, right?
Yeah.
Like you would go to Hollywood, like, what is American fantasies? What is American aspirations? What are these people trying to be? Where do they express that? Well, in art. You express that in art, like there is a certain model that is produced about being a Hollywood personality, not just in terms of movie star, etc., but even in the movies, like a rugged individual who goes into the, like, first of all, they are screwed up at the beginning, and then they become like resurrected. So they start with like drunk on like Avatar, right? He is just sort of thrown into the middle of like some alley, etc. It's like lowest of the low. And then it's like these people come makes this connection to his brother, and that's this beautiful process of resurrection and recuperation and all that. This is our fantasy. And we associate with that, we identify with that, and it's like, I mean, I'm going to the bar now because if I get really drunk and thrown out, maybe my life is going to completely change. So that this is how we live. This is our structures, our desires. Then if you want to understand like Turkish culture, you would probably go to like listen to the songs. Like, oh, I'm so tired, like I'm so much in love, life sucks, it's terrible, etc. Well, there's some kind of worldview expressed in this. Now, again, you won't take it seriously in the sense that every person is like that, but it makes that culture knowable to you. So that's the one aspect of art, for example, that defines that notion of culture. But there are also other things, of course, not just one thing, but yeah.
I don't like how you're using knowable and understand like exchangeably, because I think that there's a difference between knowing of something and actually comprehending. And I think there is a fundamental presupposition which is flawed in the idea that you can understand a culture that is not your own, and that you can even understand your own culture. Really.
Sure.
So I guess.
No, that's absolutely right. I didn't mean to suggest that understanding in terms of comprehension.
Okay.
But I meant in terms of making it an object of knowledge. No, that's a good point. Yeah. But maybe there is nothing to understand. Like, I don't want to glorify a sort of like, oh, this culture is so difficult to understand. Like, no, it's not. It's as superficial as every other culture. So there is not some kind of like depth or some valorized understanding of some deep structure of what it means to be this or that. So yeah, you're right. One needs to be careful in deploying that. Yeah. So there's something mysterious about being a Turk. You don't understand me. I'm actually so like, there's some depth here that you cannot even imagine.
Right, do you kind of understand that own history within yourself or that own depth? I guess.
No, I don't, because there isn't any. Like, that's a myth. That's what you create discursively in this kind of performance.
Yeah.
And we do that all the time. And it's like, you can never understand my experience. Like, where do you live? Like in Mars or something? Like maybe I don't understand the way you process your experience, but some like this mysterious existence that if it were, don't even bring it to language. Like, even when we express it, like in the way that we express it, we sort of build that something understandable, something deep and, not accessible to you. And we do that to other cultures too, like, oh, so mysterious. Like, this happens in the United States with respect to Indians, Native Americans. That idea is like, oh, they are so mysterious in their own way, like, whatever.
Great, I think that's a really good point. That's a question I have. It doesn't necessarily pertain to a specific reading, but you can almost make a case for like pulling an Egypt away. Like, is there any way to engage with a culture that is not your own, and to progress with that it's not really just you engaging in like academic voyeurism? Like, there is this like inherent thing when we're writing about it, when we're talking about other cultures, we're framing them as being different from our own, that we tend to glorify is the word I like to use, like mysticize it, and like it creates a very specific relationship between the reader and the author and that culture, which is inherently problematic. Is there anything, I mean, is it a question of just protection, or like the way in which we do that right, or is there any way to think like to respectfully?
Respectfully.
Not, I see, this is where language fails. Like, I'm not even saying like respectfully, but like, again, to be like non-voyeuristic.
Well, of course, I want to say yes, because you cannot categorically say no to that. But what does that mean? Like, do I have even a understanding, as you posed to me as a question, of what I consider to be my own. I don't even know how it becomes my own, because I was raised there, I interacted with people from there, therefore I have some familiarity of how things are done. I lived in the United States for the last 30 years. I have no clue how people continue and reiterate these relationships. So I don't even know whether I belong to that culture in any meaningful way. And then there are people who ostensibly relate to their own culture in this voyeuristic, formalistic way. There are a slew of academics, anthropologists from Turkey coming to the United States, studying anthropology, going back, studying their own people, because now I have an added sort of advantage of like already belonging to what I'm studying. So it's very complicated to live authentically among and with human beings, regardless whether you are from that society or not. In a way, I can argue like I am, even though I'm not an American, I didn't grow up here, I can be much more of myself than I would be in Turkey. That there is no like inherent original connection that I can, actually, I want to like this is certain psychoanalysis, I want to get rid of all those respectable relationships because they are suffocating. Like to me, is like whenever I go and stay in Turkey for 9 months, I'm like, get me out of here. And then in the United States, it's the same. Like, you know, once you live in these kind of repetitive structures of inauthenticity, you're like, okay, get me out of here. As if there's going to be a place where I can be authentically myself. There isn't. It's just this kind of negotiation. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know the answer to that question, but it's a good question. It's a good question of like, not just this pure, is there a place that I can be totally not offensive to anybody and very sort of authentically with other people? There's no formula for that.
Yeah, and I don't even think it's like, I think it's kind of bullshit to like try to like ask for authenticity when there is no such thing as authenticity. It's just a question of, can you even reach like a neutrality, I suppose? Like, I don't know.
Well, again, both neutrality and authenticity, I would say really in the relationship. So like, I cannot be authentic by myself by deciding to be authentic. It's really, there are certain relationships in which certain cultures in which, certain interactions in which you feel more yourself. That's it. That's just maybe just a feeling, maybe a kind of sort of real connection, not just performance of certain politically acceptable rules of being, you know, whatever, but like some deep connection. To me, authenticity is not like being authentically with yourself, but establishing a connection. It might happen, it might not happen. It's life. It might happen here, there, you never know, but that's not something that you can solve as a general problem, like whether it's possible or not. I mean, and it's transitory too. Like, I'm sure you had authentic encounters with people in which you felt more authentically yourself, and then it's gone. Because you are neither that person anymore, nor those people are those people anymore. So again, I go back to kind of that Hegelian framework in which even authenticity is a relationship. A good relationship. I mean, I would say, I don't know, maybe you don't like authenticity. And we don't, like, we don't want to be ourselves, yeah.
So I guess it's an interesting framework of saying authenticity rather than a state of being and having a relationship. Is that what you're trying to suggest?
I am, yes.
Okay. That helps me conceptualize it more. Thank you.
I mean, that's the sort of paradox, like sometimes you say like, I feel more about myself in the presence of these people. And I don't feel myself by myself. And it is incredibly even difficult to be sort of authentically with yourself, because we constantly tell ourselves various stories in which we mediate our relationship to ourselves. That's why this country cannot deal with the question of racism, for example. Because people think like, I can go to my room, lock the door, and be non-racist by really trying and reading and learning from anti-racist training and stuff like that. Make yourself pure. Like, of course you can, like, if you don't communicate with anybody, paradoxically, that will not help.